The Smoky Mountains, with their endless forests and winding trails, were a part of me as much as my own skin. My childhood summers were spent chasing fireflies and climbing trees, always under the watchful eyes of the ancient mountains. Even as an adult, when I became a park ranger, their allure never faded. But that night at Wolf Creek changed everything. It made me see the mountains not as a friend but as an enigma, hiding secrets darker than I could have ever imagined. It was a crisp autumn evening when the call came in. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine, the kind of scent that makes you feel alive. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to George Whitaker, and it carried a kind of panic I couldn't ignore. "My son, he's gone." George's voice cracked. "We were at Wolf Creek and he just disappeared. Please, you have to help me." I scribbled down the details. 14-year-old Ethan, last seen near the water, wearing a red jacket, and told George to stay put. I called it in to the station and let them know I was heading out. It was routine, I told myself. People get lost in the woods all the time. They wander, they panic, but we usually find them. Usually. By the time I arrived at the creek, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the forest in hues of orange and gold. George was pacing near a campsite, his flashlight jerking erratically as he scanned the tree line. "Ranger. Over here," he shouted, his voice echoing the woods. I approached him, noting the fear in his eyes and the way his hands trembled as he gestured toward the creek. "He was right here," George said, his words tumbling over each other. We were packing up to leave, and I turned around for 1 second, just 1 second, and he was gone. "I've been calling for him, but there's no answer." I nodded, trying to calm him down. "We'll find him. Let's start with the creek and work our way out." The first thing I noticed was how unnervingly quiet it was. The usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on us. I tried to shake it off as we began our search, following the faint tracks Ethan had left in the damp earth. They led us upstream, past gnarled trees and moss-covered rocks, until they simply stopped. "What the hell?" George muttered, staring at the ground. "Where could he have gone?" I crouched, examining the area. The tracks ended abruptly, but nearby, I noticed something else, prints that didn't belong. They were massive, clawed, and deeply embedded in the mud, as if whatever made them weighed more than any animal I'd ever encountered. "George," I said slowly, rising to my feet. "We should head back to the campsite." "Head back," he snapped, his voice rising. "My son is out here. We can't just leave him." Before I could respond, a rustling sound came from the trees ahead. We both froze, our flashlights trained on the darkness. Something moved, something big. It darted between the trees with an unnatural speed, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw eyes glowing in the shadows. "Did you see that?" George whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Stay close to me." We continued cautiously, the silence around us broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. The smell hit me first, a rancid, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. It grew stronger with every step until we reached a low branch where Ethan's red jacket hung, torn and stained with blood. George let out a strangled cry and lunged for the jacket, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said firmly. "This could be a trap." "A trap? What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice quivering. Before I could answer, a low growl rumbled through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. It was deep, guttural, and so close that I could feel the vibration in my chest. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. The creature stood on 2 legs, towering at least 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in matted fur, and its long, muscular arms ended in claws that looked sharp enough to tear through steel. Its face was nightmarish, a grotesque blend of canine and something else. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me, glowing amber orbs that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. It let out a roar, the kind that made the trees themselves seem to tremble. George screamed, and I grabbed his arm. "Run," I shouted. We tore through the forest, branches slapping against our faces and roots threatening to trip us at every step. The creature's footsteps thundered behind us, growing louder and closer. I glanced back and saw it leap into the air, its claws outstretched. I turned just in time to push George forward, taking the brunt of its attack myself. Its claws raked across my back, shredding my jacket and leaving shallow cuts that burned like fire. I stumbled but managed to stay on my feet, adrenaline propelling me forward. George was ahead of me now, yelling something I couldn't hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. We burst back into the clearing near the campsite, and I spun around, pulling the flare gun from my pack. The creature emerged from the trees, its eyes locked onto me. I fired, the bright red flare illuminating the forest in an instant. The creature recoiled, snarling, and retreated into the shadows. For a moment, everything was still. Then George collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "Ethan, oh God, Ethan," I placed a hand on his shoulder, my own legs threatening to give out. "We'll call for backup," I said, though my voice sounded hollow. "We'll keep searching." The rest of the night was a blur. Reinforcements arrived, but there was no sign of Ethan. The official report called it a bear attack, but I knew better. George knew better. The Smoky Mountains had taken Ethan, and whatever had done it was still out there, waiting. I stayed on as a ranger, but Wolf Creek became a place I avoided. Every so often, I hear whispers, other rangers mentioning strange sightings, hikers disappearing without a trace. And every time I think about that night, I see those glowing amber eyes, and I wonder how much longer the mountains will keep their secrets. Months passed after the incident at Wolf Creek, but the memories lingered like an unhealed wound. I tried to bury myself in work, focusing on patrolling trails, maintaining campsites, and guiding hikers. Yet every time I passed a certain ridge or heard the distant rustling of leaves, my mind would return to those glowing amber eyes and the guttural growls that haunted my dreams. The Smoky Mountains no longer felt like home, they felt like a predator waiting for me to drop my guard. George Whitaker never stopped searching for Ethan. Despite the warnings and the official conclusion, he would come back every few weeks, hiking the trails and combing the woods near Wolf Creek. I couldn't blame him. If it were my kid, I wouldn't have stopped either. But every time he returned empty-handed, the weight of guilt grew heavier on both of us. One cold December morning, as frost covered the ground and my breath formed clouds in the air, I received a call from George. His voice was strained, almost frantic. "Ranger, I found something. You need to come to Wolf Creek. Now." My stomach sank, but I grabbed my gear and headed out. The drive was eerily silent, the only sound coming from the crackling radio static that refused to tune into any station. The woods were lifeless, the usual chirping of birds and rustling of small animals conspicuously absent. When I arrived, George was waiting near the creek, his face pale and his hands trembling. "What did you find?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He pointed toward a cluster of trees. "Over there. It sits something." I followed his lead, and as I approached the area, I saw a strange formation of branches and leaves woven together into what looked like a crude shelter. Hanging from the trees were strips of fabric, tattered and weathered, but unmistakably human-made. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a scrap of red fabric tangled in the branches. "Ethan's jacket," George whispered, his voice barely audible. The shelter reeked of decay, and as I stepped closer, I noticed bones scattered around the base. Most were animal, but among them was a human femur, unmistakable in its shape. I turned to George, his face frozen in horror. "We need to leave," I said firmly. "Now." But before we could move, the forest came alive with an unnatural sound, a low, guttural hint seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. George clutched his ears, doubling over in pain. Then we heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the forest, chilling me to my core. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. The sound was primal, ancient, and filled with a rage that seemed to seep into my very bones. "We need to go," I repeated, grabbing George by the arm and pulling him back toward the creek. But the moment we turned, we saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them. Glowing amber orbs staring at us from the darkness. They moved closer, and as they stepped into the dim light, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't just one creature, they were many. Similar in appearance to the beast I had encountered months ago, but each one slightly different. Some were larger, others smaller. Some had elongated snouts, while others had almost human-like faces twisted into grotesque snarls. They moved with a deliberate, predatory grace, surrounding us on all sides. George screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. My hand instinctively went to the flare gun on my belt, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. There were too many of them. Then, as if choreographed, the creatures stopped moving. They stood still, their amber eyes locked onto us. The largest of them, a hulking beast with scars crisscrossing its chest and a missing eye, stepped forward. Its gaze bore into me, and for a brief moment I felt something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just rage, it was recognition. "Run," I whispered to George. "Run as fast as you can." "What about you?" he asked, panic in his voice. "Just go," I shouted, pulling the flare gun and firing it into the air. The bright light momentarily blinded the creatures, and George took off, sprinting toward the creek. I backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on the leader. It growled low, the sound vibrating through the air, but it didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It pointed. A long, clawed finger extended toward the shelter we had found. I didn't understand at first, but as I turned my flashlight toward the structure, I saw movement. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Ethan, but he wasn't the same. His eyes glowed amber, just like the creatures. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he were being controlled by invisible strings. He stepped forward, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out, only a low, guttural growl. I froze, my mind racing. What had they done to him? Was he even still human? The creatures watched me, their leader still pointing at Ethan as if presenting him to me. "Ethan," I whispered, taking a step toward him. The boy tilted his head, mimicking the leader's gesture. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his glowing eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came. The leader growled again, this time louder, more insistent. They were giving him back, or at least, what was left of him. I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to grab Ethan and run, but as I reached for him, the leader let out a deafening roar, and the creatures closed in. Ethan turned and ran back toward the shelter, disappearing into the shadows. The leader stepped closer, its massive frame looming over me. For a moment I thought it would kill me, but instead, it leaned down, its grotesque face inches from mine. It snarled, then turned and vanished into the darkness, the others following in its wake. I stood there, trembling, until George returned with backup. I couldn't explain what had happened, what I had seen. They would never believe me anyway. But as we left the forest that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a warning. Ethan was gone, taken by the creatures of the Smoky Mountains. And whatever they weren't done with us. Not yet. The weeks that followed were an endless blur of questions, nightmares, and uneasy patrols through the forest. George Whitaker disappeared from public view, retreating into the isolation of his grief and perhaps his shame. He'd seen Ethan just as I had, but the boy he remembered, the boy we both knew, was gone, twisted into something else. What haunted me most wasn't the loss itself, but the lingering sense that I had failed. Not just Ethan, but the other hikers who had vanished without a trace. The Smoky Mountains had always been a place of beauty, mystery, and a little danger. But now, every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a potential harbinger of something sinister. I threw myself into my work, diving deeper into the park's history, the folklore surrounding it, and even unearthing records of missing persons over the decades. The patterns were too consistent to ignore: Wolf Creek, strange sightings, people disappearing only to reappear in unrecognizable forms or not at all. One rainy evening, as I sifted through old ranger logs, I found an entry that stopped me cold. It was dated nearly 40 years ago, written by a ranger named Elias McKinnon. His handwriting was erratic, his tone frantic, but his words were hauntingly familiar. The eyes. They're watching. They've been here long before us, long before the settlers. We call them the Watchers, but they are more than that. They are the guardians of something ancient, something we don't understand. Those who trespass too far, who find their sacred places, pay the price. Some are taken. Others are changed. I saw one today. It looked like a boy, but it wasn't. Its eyes gave it away, and the way it moved like it didn't know how to wear its own skin. They're not just predators, they're collectors. The entry ended abruptly, the last line smeared as though Elias had dropped his pen mid-sentence. I searched for more entries from him, but there were none. Elias had vanished from the records, much like the hikers he described. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was unraveling a story far bigger than I'd anticipated, a story that had no clear answers. But there was one thing I knew: I had to go back. Not just to Wolf Creek, but to the heart of it all, to the places the locals refused to name and the maps conveniently omitted. If Ethan was still out there, if there was even a sliver of hope, I owed it to George to find him. And if I couldn't bring him back, maybe I could at least understand what had happened to him. The return to Wolf Creek felt like marching into my own grave. I brought more gear this time: a rifle, a GPS device, a flare gun, and enough provisions to last several days. I also brought something I hadn't used in years: a small, worn Bible that my grandmother had given me when I was a kid. I didn't consider myself religious, but I needed all the help I could get. The forest was different this time. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the usual sounds of wildlife were muted, as if the animals themselves were holding their breath. As I reached the ridge overlooking Wolf Creek, I saw the same eerie fog rolling through the valley, thick and impenetrable. It felt alive, a living shroud hiding the secrets of the watchers. The shelter George and I had found was still there, but it had changed. The crude construction of branches and leaves now seemed more deliberate, almost ceremonial. Strange symbols were etched into the bark of nearby trees, spirals and jagged lines that made my skin crawl. The ground was littered with bones, not just animal bones, but human as well. Some were old, weathered and yellowed with age, while others were fresh, their marrow still visible. I was not alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The watchers were nearby. I could feel their presence. I clutched my rifle, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the ground, the same sound George and I had heard before. It grew louder, more insistent, and with it came the glowing amber eyes. They emerged from the shadows one by one, a dozen or more, their forms even more grotesque than I remembered. The leader was among them, its scarred chest heaving with each labored breath. Its single eye locked onto me, and it growled low, a guttural sound that seemed almost amused. "I'm not leaving," I said aloud, my voice trembling but resolute. "Not until I get answers." The leader tilted its head, its expression unreadable. Then it pointed again, not at the shelter this time, but at me. The hum grew louder, and I felt a strange pull, like an invisible force was dragging me forward. I resisted, planting my feet firmly on the ground, but the pull grew stronger, relentless. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell. When I woke, I was in darkness. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, illuminating a cavern that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen on the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. I wasn't alone. Ethan was there, sitting against the wall with his knees pulled to his chest. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, but his expression was vacant, almost childlike. When he saw me, he tilted his head, just as the leader had done. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice echoing in the cavern. "It's me. I'm here to take you home." He didn't respond. Instead, he stood and began walking deeper into the cavern. I followed, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The deeper we went, the stronger the hum became, vibrating through my very bones. The cavern opened into a massive chamber, and at its center was a pool of black, shimmering liquid. The watchers surrounded it, their forms kneeling in what appeared to be reverence. Ethan stopped at the edge of the pool and turned to face me. "This is what they wanted," a voice said, though it didn't come from Ethan. It came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the chamber like a thunderclap. "This is what they protect." "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It is the source," the voice replied. "The connection between your world and theirs. And it is hungry." Ethan stepped closer to the pool, and I realized with horror what was about to happen. The watchers were offering him as a sacrifice to what I didn't know, but I couldn't let it happen. "Ethan, no," I shouted, running toward him. The leader moved to block my path, its massive frame looming over me. I raised my rifle and fired, the sound echoing through the chamber. The bullet struck its chest, but it barely flinched. Instead, it grabbed me with clawed hands and threw me across the chamber like a rag doll. I hit the ground hard, my head spinning, but I forced myself to get up. Ethan was at the edge of the pool now, his feet sinking into the black liquid. I drew the flare gun from my belt and fired it into the air. The bright light illuminated the chamber, and the watchers recoiled, their growls filling the air. Seizing the moment, I ran to Ethan and grabbed him, pulling him back from the pool. The liquid hissed as it retreated, almost as if it were alive. The watchers howled in rage, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The leader charged, but I aimed the flare gun and fired directly at its face. The flare struck it in the eye socket, and it screamed, a sound so loud and piercing that I thought my eardrums would burst. It staggered back, clutching its face, and I took the opportunity to drag Ethan out of the chamber. The cavern began to shake, rocks falling from the ceiling as the pool roared and churned. I didn't look back, focusing only on getting Ethan to safety. We stumbled through the darkness, the hum growing fainter with each step. When we finally emerged into the daylight, I collapsed, gasping for air. Ethan lay beside me, his glowing eyes fading back to their normal brown. He looked at me, his expression confused but human. "Ranger," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, kid," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm here." I quit my job the next day. The mountains had taken enough from me, and I couldn't face them anymore. But I knew I couldn't run from what I'd seen. The Watchers were still out there, guarding their sacred places, and I had trespassed where no one was meant to go. Ethan was alive, but he would never be the same. Neither would I. And as I left the Smoky Mountains for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, just a temporary reprieve. The days after Ethan's rescue were a blur of chaos, silence, and questions that could never fully be answered. The boy's reappearance made national news, though no one outside the park's inner circle knew the full truth. Officials spun a story about a wilderness accident, a miraculous survival. Ethan's injuries were explained as animal attacks, and his memory loss was dismissed as trauma-induced amnesia. George Whitaker looked like a man saved and damned all at once. He had his son back, but the glimmer in Ethan's eyes, the joy, the curiosity was gone. He was alive, yes, but changed. Just like me. I stayed silent about what I'd seen, though the nightmares spoke for me. I couldn't sleep without hearing the hum of the pool, feeling the suffocating presence of the Watchers, or seeing that black liquid reaching for me like sentient death. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the cavern, running, screaming, failing. It wasn't just the fear, it was the guilt. I'd brought Ethan back, but at what cost? What had I disturbed in those ancient halls? What had I awakened? I couldn't stay away. Quitting the job hadn't changed anything. The forest was in my blood, and the unanswered questions gnawed at my sanity. One night, weeks after the rescue, I found myself driving back to the Smoky Mountains, my mind a storm of doubts, regrets, and a sickening curiosity. The road twisted and turned through the dark, the headlights cutting through the mist like knives. It was as if the mountains were calling me back, pulling me into their depths for one last confrontation. The trail to Wolf Creek was untouched since my last visit. The forest was silent, oppressive. Every branch seemed to reach for me. Every shadow threatened to come alive. My feet carried me forward, past the abandoned shelter, past the ridge, and finally to the entrance of the cavern where it had all begun. The air here was heavy, charged with the same unnatural energy I remembered. The Watchers weren't visible, but I felt them, their eyes boring into my back, their presence palpable. I stepped into the cave, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. The stench hit me immediately, a mix of rot, damp earth, and something metallic, like blood. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The hum was there too, faint at first but growing louder with every step. When I reached the main chamber, the pool was waiting for me. The black liquid shimmered, reflecting the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. The Watchers stood in a circle around it, their glowing eyes fixed on me. But this time they didn't move. They simply stood there, watching, waiting. The leader emerged from the shadows, its scarred chest heaving, its single eye locked onto mine. It didn't growl or attack. Instead, it pointed at the pool. The meaning was clear. It wanted me to approach. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run, but something deeper pulled me forward. I stepped closer to the pool, the hum vibrating through my bones. The liquid seemed alive, writhing and churning as if it sensed my presence. I looked at the leader, my voice trembling as I asked the question that had haunted me since that night. "What is it?" The leader didn't answer, but the pool did. Images flashed across its surface, too fast to comprehend, like memories being played in reverse. I saw mountains rising from the earth, rivers carving their paths through the land, and creatures that weren't quite human walking among the trees. I saw rituals, sacrifices, and the same black liquid flowing like blood through the veins of the forest. "This is their connection," a voice said, though it didn't come from any of the Watchers. It came from the pool itself, echoing in my mind, their anchor, their prison. "Prison," I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. "They are guardians," the voice continued. "Bound to this place, bound to protect the balance. But the balance has been broken. You broke it." The weight of those words crushed me. My actions had consequences far beyond what I could have imagined. I had trespassed, disrupted something ancient and sacred. And now the Watchers were paying the price. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The pool shimmered, and the leader stepped forward, placing a clawed hand on my shoulder. The gesture was almost gentle, but its meaning was clear. A choice. My choice. I could leave, walk away, and let the forest swallow its secrets once more. Or I could stay, take on the burden of what I had disrupted, and help restore the balance. It wasn't much of a choice. The mountains had already taken so much from me. What was one more sacrifice? "I'll stay," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The leader nodded, and the Watchers stepped back, their eyes glowing brighter as the pool began to churn violently. The liquid rose, forming a column that reached for the ceiling. I felt a pull, stronger than anything I'd ever experienced, dragging me toward the pool. I didn't resist. I let it take me. The world dissolved into darkness, the hum consuming everything. And then I saw at the shadow plane. It was a place of endless night, where the rules of our world didn't apply. The Watchers moved freely here, their forms shifting and changing, no longer bound by flesh. The pool was their lifeline, their tether to the physical world. And now it was mine too. I woke on the forest floor, the dawn light filtering through the trees. My body ached, but I was alive. The Watchers were gone, their presence replaced by a profound stillness. The pool was dry, its power drained, at least for now. I stood, brushing the dirt from my clothes, and looked out at the forest. It was different now, quieter, as if holding its breath. The balance had been restored, but at what cost? I was no longer just a ranger. I was a guardian, bound to the forest and its secrets. There was no quitting, no walking away. The mountains owned me now, and they always would. As I turned to leave, a single amber eye glowed faintly in the distance, a silent reminder of the pact I had made. The forest had its balance, and I had my answers. But the price was everything I had been, and everything I would ever be.